we're looking at reproductive isolation mechanisms, and we're going to focus in this segment on post-mating mechanisms. So we're going to assume that the two organisms managed to mate, but preventing hybrid offspring from developing if mating actually does take place is what post-mating mechanisms are all about. So, mechanical isolation. In animals, mating is possible, we're assuming, but the gametes cannot reach each other or fuse. In plants, for example, the gametes or the sex organs ripen at different times, so even if pollination does take place, the pollen cannot fuse with the ovule because the ovule isn't ripe at the same time. And so the two gametes are brought together, but they can't actually reach each other or come to the point where they can actually fuse. Another post-mating isolation mechanism is mortality, and you'll remember that word mortality from our work on population studies. Mortality means death. So, fertilization may take place, but the zygote that is formed develops abnormally and dies. Usually a spontaneous abortion occurs early in the development of the zygote. Let's say that the two gametes got together and that fertilization did take place and that there was no mortality of that zygote. Well, then another post-mating isolation mechanism is put in place, and that is sterility. The hybrid is born, but it's infertile or sterile, and it cannot produce offspring itself. A mule is an example of a sterile hybrid, which results from a cross between a horse and a donkey. And because the horse and the donkey have different chromosome numbers, when these chromosomes recombine in the offspring, which is the mule, there's an uneven number of chromosomes. So it cannot actually undergo meiosis successfully to produce mule gametes, and so the mule becomes sterile or is sterile. Let's say that the F1, the first filial generation hybrid, is sterile. So the gametes got together, the zygote was viable, it didn't die, and the offspring is produced, and it's sterile. Well, we have our last level of post-mating isolation mechanisms, reduction in fitness. The F1 hybrid is fertile, but when the F1 hybrid produces the F2 hybrid, that is infertile or much lower reproductive fitness than the F1 or the parental species. And so the grandchildren, in other words, the offspring at the second filial generation would be infertile or would not be able to reproduce. And so all of these reproductive isolating mechanisms would take place after mating had taken place. And so we have several plausible methods of how speciation occurs. We know that we've discussed only allopatry in our lessons, but we know that there are different models that exist for accounting for speciation, and we know that there are different mechanisms put in place to keep those species separate. But it's very hard for us to actually get an eyewitness account and say, right, that is speciation happening. We can see there is speciation. And why is that so, do you think? Well, of course, speciation takes generations and generations. It happens over a very long period of time, usually much longer than our lifetime. So it's difficult to see that a speciation event is taking place. We can figure out that it happens and we can figure out when it happened, but it's more difficult to point out there, it's happening in that population right now. So something very interesting is taking place off the mainland of South America in the Caribbean island of Anguilla. In the summer of 1995, about 15 iguanas survived Hurricane Marilyn on a raft of trees, and they were transported across to Anguilla. And these few individuals were the first kind of their iguana to reach the island. And what scientists would like to know is what will happen next. Is this what happened to the Galapagos tortoises? Will those iguanas die out, or will they speciate and become a brand new species? And if they're reintroduced to the mainland, will they no longer be able to reproduce with their original parental or ancestral stock? It's too soon to tell, but it's an interesting idea, and it could be speciation happening. Thank you for your time today. I look forward to seeing you again next week. Goodbye.